What's up, guys? It is your boy Simone Fan 101, and I'm sorry that I am making this video this late. It's almost 10:45 at night, and I just finished watching the movie, wondering why it took me so long. A, I just needed a day to myself, and B, well, let's face it, I was kind of lazy. But mainly it was I was, a little bit tired. I woke up at freaking 3 o'clock this morning. How the hell I'm even awake right now is a mystery. But maybe it's just because the amount of energy I have. With that said, let's get into part 5 of Star Wars Mania. That being my review of Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. This movie was released in 2002. Once again, George Lucas came back to do the story and the directing. However, this time around, there was a second screenwriter. He didn't. Well, okay, he did do the sole screenwriting, but upon the third draft, he was, or should I say, upon development of the third draft, he hired Jonathan Hales to work with him on the third draft, which apparently was created or should I say, it was finished a week before Episode 2 started filming, which, yeah, that might contribute to some of the problems in this movie. And yikes. Some people might have thought Episode 1 was bad. Man, Episode 2, no wonder why Doug Walker considers this movie to be the worst of the live-action Star Wars movies. I can see why. Now, do I hate the movie? No. Do I like the movie? Yeah. Let's get into the plot. The basic plot of the movie is apparently there's a separatist movement going on in the Galactic Republic. What did I say? Repugnant? Oh man, that's good. The Galactic Republic. Clearly, I've been awake too long. Thank God I have water. 10 years have gone by since the events of Episode 1, and a separatist movement has begun due to the Republic wanting to create basically what's a military creation act. My guess is they're trying to create their own military, and the people who are not a part of it is like, fuck this. We're separating from the Republic. We're not doing this shit. And and apparently they're going to various organizations that, I guess you could say, have their own armies, but also have differing opinions from the Republic. Specifically, the Trade Federation, which is still run by Viceroy Gunray from the first movie. And one of the people trying to make sure this law, it's not really explained too well, and you can tell because, again, the writing in this movie is kind of weak. But it's never explicitly explained whether the senator of Naboo, who is Padme Amidala, who of course was the queen last time we saw her in Episode 1, it's said that, it was later said that she's against the Military Creation Act, but if the Creation Act is why the Separatists are leaving, then how the hell does that make any sense for the plot of the beginning of the movie? And again, it's part of the writing. It's inconsistent writing, and sadly, this isn't the only time inconsistency would run amok in this film. But with that being said, let's continue on. After an attempt, pretty much in like the first 2 minutes of the movie, the Jedi, as well as Chancellor Palpatine, have ordered 2 Jedi in order to protect Padme Amidala, that being Anakin Skywalker, now played by Hayden Christensen, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, returning role, of course, is Ewan McGregor. And they're assigned, of course, to protect Padme. Through yet another assassination attempt that runs awry, and one of the assassins being killed, it's decided by both the Council and Chancellor Palpatine that Anakin would escort Padme back to Naboo and be basically her bodyguard while Obi-Wan goes to do investigation for trying to figure out who it is that's actually trying to kill the senator. Um, and this is where the movie has like a little bit of the Empire Strikes Back motto, where it jumps from one group of people to another group of people. Although sometimes we also cut back to the Jedi and what's happening on Coruscant. But mostly, it's Obi-Wan doing his investigation and Anakin protecting the senator. And this, of course, leads to what is the biggest key and is also one of the biggest problems of this movie, if not the biggest. The execution of the romance between Anakin and Padme. I'll get to that later. Again, I'm getting the positives and negatives later. Let's get to the plot right now. Obi-Wan finds out on Kamino that Jango Fett is a bounty hunter, and supposedly the bounty hunter is looking for, but he's also part of this bigger scheme, bigger plan, in which he gave his DNA to create a bunch of clones as a clone army for the Galactic Republic. And of course, it's explained that supposedly a Jedi Master by the name of Sifo Dyas is the one who authorized the creation of a clone army. He was the one that ordered it in the first place, with or without, and it turned out without the word of the Senate or the Jedi Council. And after finding this out and finding out that Jango Fett is indeed a bounty hunter and seems suspicious, Obi-Wan goes to track Jango Fett down and capture him. Of course, that doesn't work. And we actually get a pretty cool fight scene between Obi-Wan and Jango Fett that I actually do like. They fly away, Obi-Wan takes chase, and they end up on the planet of Geonosis, where Obi-Wan finds out that not only, because it was explicitly said at the beginning of the movie that leading the Separatist movement is Count Dooku. It's not explained in this movie, but basically Count Dooku left the Jedi Order pretty soon after the death of Qui-Gon Jinn from Episode 1. Qui-Gon Jinn, as was explained to Obi-Wan, was Count Dooku's student. Count Dooku was Qui-Gon Jinn's master, so it makes sense that he would leave. And Count Dooku is leading the Separatist movement along with several other affiliates, including the Trade Federation Viceroy Newt Gunray, and have several different types of battle droid armies basically created. Meanwhile, with Anakin and Padme, a romance begins to bloom. They're on Naboo, they're spending time together. Clearly there's feelings there, but even though it's clear at one point they want to be together, they choose not to fall in love because of their differing careers. Padme's a senator, and therefore her life is pretty much always in the public eye, and as a Jedi, Anakin is not allowed to form attachments. So marriage, overly strong bonds with a certain person of the opposite sex, all of those things are forbidden among Jedi because they believe attachments lead down to the dark side, which, if you've seen Revenge of the Sith, well, you can kind of figure how that one goes. But Anakin is haunted by dreams of it. Anakin, as also said in the beginning of the movie, is haunted by dreams of his mom being tortured. And at one point it gets too far where he has to leave Naboo and take Padme along with her in order to find his mom. They, as well as R2-D2, go to Tatooine and eventually find out that her mother Shmi was sold to the Lars family. Klieg Lars, his son Owen, who would of course be Uncle Owen in New Hope, as well as his girlfriend Beru, again, who would become Aunt Beru in A New Hope. And of course eventually become the caretakers of Luke Skywalker. it's through them that he finds out that a group of Tusken Raiders kidnapped his mom over a month prior. And Anakin goes out to find her, and eventually does, in a Tusken Raider camp. And he finds her alive, but mere moments after finding his mom, she dies in his arms, and Anakin takes his first step into the dark side by just going full-on psycho and just murdering every single Tusken Raider at the camp. And he makes it very clear later to Padme, not just the men, he killed the women, and he killed the children too. Because he was fucking pissed, and he wanted revenge in the worst way. He wanted payback. And so they're all dead. He knows this is a problem after the fact. He knows that he shouldn't be this angry because he is a Jedi and he knows he's better than this. Of course, Padme is really the only shoulder for comfort, as Anakin doesn't really know the Lars family that well. And after burying his mom, they eventually get word from R2-D2 and even of course the translator C-3PO, who of course along with Shmi was also sold to the Lars family. Which is actually surprising. I will say that's another inconsistency. Although that Owen does not recognize C-3PO. The name 3PO, the fact that Owen does not recognize who 3PO is in Episode 4. Again, another moment of inconsistency. I wish there was a way they could have fixed that. But again, I'll save that later. And this is where the two parties eventually meet. Obi-Wan gets captured trying to feed information to the Jedi Council and the other people on Coruscant, but eventually has to send it to Anakin because his signal's too far out of reach. Anakin and Padme eventually get the message with the help of 3PO and R2, and not only do they retransmit the message, despite going against Mace Windu's orders, they go to try to rescue Obi-Wan, an event that eventually does not pan too well, and they get captured. Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Padme are all set up in a public execution in a giant coliseum. Immediately before entering the coliseum, though, Padme, who was the more hesitant of the two to try to be with Anakin, she eventually confesses her love to Anakin, in a moment where she feels that, okay, if we're gonna die here, I might as well get my feelings out now. And of course Anakin reciprocates because he's all over that ass. So the three of them eventually fight back, and as they're being cornered by a bunch of droids trying to, fight them off, a giant group of Jedi led by Mace Windu, Jedi Knights, Jedi Masters, the Council members, they all stage a giant rescue, and incoming, let's face it, the best scene in the whole movie, where a bunch of Jedi basically go to fucking battle against the droids. This scene is pretty awesome, and it also helps that, with the exception of one Jedi, most of the Jedi are either humans or there in practical effects in terms of the makeup, which is good. Eventually they're cornered, but Yoda, who went to Kamino, arrives with the clone army and fights off the droids. Eventually the droids are in full retreat, and Anakin and Obi-Wan, during the ensuing chaos, go to fight Dooku. Dooku pretty much kicks both of their asses, but then Yoda shows up and basically shows Dooku who's boss. He fights off all of Dooku's his force powers, his Sith lightning, as well as the saber skills. But Dooku escapes after using a diversion to try to kill Anakin and Obi-Wan, and of course Yoda has to help them because, well, he must save them. And our movie ends when it is shown that Anakin and Padme get married, and that the Clone Wars has officially begun while Obi-Wan ponders information Dooku told him earlier that the Senate was taken over by the Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Sidious. And of course we don't get a lot of the Emperor. Darth Sidious, by the way, is the Emperor. We don't get a lot of the Emperor in this movie. We only really get the Emperor at the very end, and Again, his hood is over where you can't entirely see his face. You can only see his lower jaw. And that's how our movie ends with the beginning of the Clone Wars. So, how to talk about this movie? Well, let's go over one of the biggest things. If you saw my review of Phantom Menace, you might be a little bit put off that the movie review was 37 minutes long. That's because I explained a hell of a lot of things in that movie. That movie, and George Lucas really wanted to tell a lot of backstory, but apparently he really wanted to tell it in episodes 1 and episode 3. In episode 2, there was kind of a gap, which you could say was meant for more character development, but it was clear that episode 1, with the amount of plot it had, the movie was going too fast, and you didn't have a chance to fully digest certain things that were going on. In episode 2, it's often too slow, with certain scenes that didn't need to be in there. The movie runs at 2 hours and 22 minutes. I believe up until The Force Awakens came out, this was the longest running time for Star Wars, even longer than episode 6 and episode 3. So yeah, this movie outbeat the finales of 2 trilogies, and that actually goes in part of the problem with this movie. I get what it was trying to do, but I think the movie was just too long. If it had been about 20 minutes shorter, if certain scenes had been more concise and made a little bit more sense, I think this movie would have gotten at least a little bit of a better rap than it does. As it is, we got what we got. So, let's get the negatives out of the way, because, oh boy, the negatives are big. Like I said, this movie's often too slow, and even with the plot that it has, it stretches it out so much where it's like, okay, can we get this moseying along now? Specifically with the romance plot between Anakin and Padme. And that leads me to my second biggest problem with this movie, is the fact that the romance, not that the actors aren't the problem, so to speak. It's the dialogue and the way it's written. The writing in this movie is definitely the weakest of the prequel trilogy. And if you've seen episode 1, you could probably ask yourself, well, how the hell is that possible? Well, remember when I said earlier how Jonathan Hales was brought on board to help co-write the script for this movie? Well, here's the problem with that. Apparently, during the making of this movie, Lucas, and George Lucas, he knew that it was a little bit hesitant for him to write the second movie. So, basically, what happened was, a few months before, filming for the movie began, he got the first script of episode 2 out. Then, eventually, he got a second draft of episode 2. And when he went to the third and final draft, before shooting began, he went to Jonathan Hales. Jonathan Hales, for those of you who don't know, and it's probably all of you, had been in the industry for quite a long time, and had written mainly for TV shows. Manhunt in 1970, and he also wrote several episodes for a TV show called The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. The problem? He's only really known for TV writing. He only has a few movie credits under his name, and the only other movie credit that he has in recent years was a movie that was released the same year this movie came out of, which was The Scorpion King. And to be fair, he also had a co-writer in Stephen Sommers. So we don't know exactly what the extent of Jonathan Hales' writing is. And Jonathan Hales, for those of you curious enough to know, is actually older than George Lucas himself. He was born in 1937. He's 81 years old. He's older than Lucas himself, so maybe if they had gotten someone younger, that would have definitely fixed things, but as it was, this didn't help the problems. As a matter of fact, it only made it worse. Like I said, this movie has the worst writing of pretty much all Star Wars movies with the exception of maybe Episode 8. And of course I'll get to Episode 8 when I review The Last Jedi. And the writing really, I mean, of course we all know the terrible line. I don't like saying it's coarse, rough, and irritating, and it gets everywhere. That line lives on in infamy. And yeah, the writing in this movie isn't the greatest. There's the basic story, which is okay. The story itself is actually not a bad story. Again, this is a case, much like with Phantom Menace, where the story is a good story. It's just that the writing is just not on the movie's side. And in Episode 2, that's even made more apparent than it was in Episode 1. Hang on a second. I mean, for example, you have that. I already mentioned the scene earlier with Owen Lars knowing 3PO, despite the fact that in Episode 4, he has no clue about 3PO's existence. He treats him as another droid. And how the Military Creation Act worked at the beginning of the movie, and how that was very quickly dropped with the creation of the Clone Army. And it's just not as concise as it was in the first movie. And even the first movie, it wasn't really that concise, but it seemed to have at least a little bit of a level playing field. In this movie, honestly, bringing on Jonathan Hales probably was a downgrade. And it also doesn't help that the third draft of this movie was completed only a week before filming began. Yeah, that is a bad sign. That your script is only completed a week before shooting for the movie begins. That would never fly today. That would never fly. At least it should never fly. At least in Disney. What about the CGI? Because I made mention in the first movie, Episode 1, I mean, how the CGI hasn't really aged well, especially for the creatures, but for the droids, it at least looked okay. And of course, the spaceships and the the droid battleship looked alright. What about in this movie? Well, most of the things that looked good in Episode 1 still look good here. The droids look a lot better. They definitely look more realistic, and then some of them actually look pretty badass. The clones are kind of in the same league as the droids from the Episode 1, in which they're not perfect, but they're definitely not, like, awful. Like, they're okay. They're kind of like the droids from Episode 1. They're okay. They're probably a little bit better than the droids from Episode 1, but like I said, the CG for them is okay. Most of the ships and stuff, they still look good. The explosions, honestly, one of my favorite CG effects is the seismic bomb things from the little chase scene between Jango Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi, the space scene in Geonosis. But there are bad instances of CG, which is why I bring it up in the negative category. Like in Episode 1, a lot of the creatures do not look right. Granted, they do look better than they do in Episode 1, but Watto, who makes an appearance in this movie, Jar Jar Binks, even Master Yoda. Master Yoda doesn't... All those creatures, as CG models go, they don't look that great. They're not awful. Get that right. We've seen worse CGI, especially in Episode 1 and Godzilla 98, but they're not that good. And honestly, the worst case of CGI is with the Kaminoans. When Obi-Wan goes to Kamino, and the native people, they by far look the worst in terms of CG creatures in this film. It really isn't until the last act of the movie when the CG starts to improve. Again, the Geonosians do not, much like with the Kaminoans. The Geonosians do not look that good, but but I will admit the effects for the three execution creatures, again, not perfect, but they look decent enough. I especially like the bull with the giant ring around its nose. I'm guessing that bull is a goth kid. I do not want to know about that bull's issues, and we're not going to continue that. That's bad. I'm sorry. that's too bad. Um, Another major complaint, and everyone's brought this up, and I'm going to bring it up too. Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker. Now, I'm not going to say that this is a good performance. It's not. But I'm not going to blame that solely on Christensen, because for several reasons. One, the writing was just not on his side here. He did not have the best luck in terms of the writing when it comes to episode 2. It just did not favor him. It didn't really favor anyone, but especially not Christensen, who, if I recall correctly, was a relatively unknown at the time that this movie was filmed. Because I looked up how the casting went for Hayden Christensen, and apparently, much like with episode 4 and 5, when looking for stars in this movie, they went looking for relative unknowns and not looking for the big-name actors. And that I will give George Lucas credit for, is that he wanted someone who wasn't a well-established actor. He wanted someone who was an unknown who could take the role. And you can see, and I'm not going to say that he was the worst performance of the movie, he was the worst part of the movie, because he's not. I think, honestly, the worst part of this movie is the execution of the plot in terms of the writing. That was the worst part of this movie, if I had to say it. And there are other little things I don't like, but these are just some of the big things. Hayden Christensen, he has some bad dialogue, he's got to say. It also doesn't help that when he's with Obi-Wan, half the time he's a dick to him, even though Obi-Wan is his master. And again, I don't blame Christensen. I blame the writing. He's written in a way where can be pretty disrespectful to his master. We don't really get to see a sense of friendship between the two. We only get a sense of only kind of contempt for Obi-Wan from Anakin's side, and that's not what we wanted to see. We wanted to see these two Jedi get along. Yeah, have some banter back and forth, but we wanted to see them get along. Something that Episode 3, thankfully, would do a much better job at. Episode 2, on the other hand, it really hasn't aged well. There are moments of, proverbial moments of brilliance from Hayden Christensen. Like when he's flying the little ship thing on Coruscant with Obi-Wan inside of it and making Obi-Wan worry on purpose. That I thought was kind of funny. Let's see here. In terms of acting, not even. I'm trying to think of moments with Obi-Wan. There's honestly not a lot. But in terms of acting, there are a couple moments, specifically when he's angry. On Tatooine, when his mother dies, when he goes full-on ballistic, he is pissed and he shows emotion. And even afterward, when he confesses to Padme exactly what he did, he showed more emotion. It's not perfect, but he's showing emotion. You can see him crying, and there's actually some emoting and acting from there. During the picnic scene when he's with Padme, there's a couple of moments of emotion with him. And here's the thing, I'm not going to blame Christensen, because Hayden Christensen himself later said in an interview that George Lucas told him to hold back his acting for Episode 2 in order to make his acting gig in Episode 3 more striking, make it a more memorable role. Clearly that was a bad sign, because Hayden Christensen is known to be one of the worst parts of this movie, and it's not hard to see why. I'm not going to blame Christensen, because there are times when he does seem to act at least decently okay in this movie. It's just that the scenes that are bad with him are laughably bad, that you have no choice but to remember them. So I've gotten over all the negatives. What about the positives? What are the positives of episode 2? Well, there are positives. Um, the action is still very good, very entertaining at time, and of course, like I said, when the movie does pick up at the end, when the Coliseum fight, the action is pretty kick ass. I mean, you get the giant ships blowing up, droids being torn into pieces, Jedi swinging lightsabers, things, pillars falling over, Jedi using the Force, Dooku with the Sith lightning. Um, all of it's pretty good. I guess if there's one little minor complaint about the action, is honestly what was the best part of episode 1, which was the final action scene between the main characters and the villain of the movie. It was once again 2-on-1. It was Dooku against Obi-Wan and Anakin, but the action is not really that good, and I think... Now, granted, I didn't look this up, and I could be wrong on this, but it looked like Christopher Lee, who, by the way, does a really good job as Dooku in the little screen time he has in this movie. I think he does not all of it, but most of the choreography himself. Whereas in episode 3, there were moments where it was clear there was clearly a stunt double for him. But in this movie, unless I'm wrong, there wasn't too many stunt double shots, because you saw a lot of facial shots for Christopher Lee as Count Dooku. And you could clearly tell this day it was Lee in the movie. So, and even though I did like the fighting between Dooku and Yoda, it was brief. So, yeah, the fighting between Anakin, Obi-Wan, and especially Obi-Wan and Dooku was really underwhelming. But aside from that, most of the action in the movie is pretty solid. The Coliseum fight, like I said, is fucking awesome. Once again, the acting from Ewan McGregor is great. Some of the side characters are, even though if you don't see them long, like Klieg, Lars, Dex, who runs the diner, even though the CG for him is pretty bad, I mean, it kind of is. He has plenty of personality. Like I said, not all of the movie works, and the writing doesn't help it. But there are several good things about it. I think there's enough good things where, if you can stomach the bad stuff, you can get through and find some of the good stuff that is in this movie. Some of the shots look good. The CG for the worlds, much like in episode 1, look really good in this movie. They look pretty fantastic. Some of the like the picnic scene where the waterfalls in the background, that looks beautiful. You have the look of the movie. You know what people are dressed as. The style. That all looks really good, just like it did in the first movie. And there are other, of course, Frank Oz's Yoda. And speaking of CG, while the CG in the 2 scenes with 3PO doesn't really work that well, I will say that when I first saw 3PO, I thought for sure that 3PO was CG when we saw him on Tatooine, because it looked almost too realistic. I'm like, okay, that has to be CG. There's no way our 3PO moves like that. And apparently, no. Anthony Daniel did most of the actual moving. And I'm like, wow, I was legitimately shocked. And I'm like, wow, they actually made, Anthony Daniels 3PO come to life in terms of, him in the suit. Because in the first movie, as I looked up after my review of episode 1, that was all puppeteering. That wasn't a suit. That wasn't CG either. That was a giant puppet. Which is really impressive, actually, that they didn't go for CG. But yeah, when you first see 3PO, you might be confused and think, is he really CG? No, he's in a suit. Which is actually incredible on their part, that they made it look that realistic, that it's not CG, and he moves so fluidly, but again, he's not CG, so you gotta give credit to Anthony Daniel for being able to physically emote a little better than even he did sometimes in the original trilogy. And of course we get signs of 3PO and R2's relationship, with at one point being called R2 being called an idiot by 3PO, which I will admit that was funny. And like I said, the writing of this movie is the weakest, but it does have moments of brilliance, like when 3PO goes after R2 and on Geonosis, and they bar back and forth, very reminiscent of their relationship in the original trilogy. One of my favorite scenes in the whole movie, is the Death Sticks line on Coruscant when they're chasing Zam Wessel. She's the one who's trying to kill Padme along with Jango Fett in the beginning of the movie. Um, and you want to go home and rethink your life. I want to go home and rethink my life. I'm not doing the scene justice, but that scene makes me laugh every single time I see it. It's just legitimately funny, and it's like, wow. So yeah, there are good things in this movie. Is that enough for you to see it? I grew up with this movie, so if you grew up with this movie, there's enough for you to go back and see it. If you didn't grow up with this movie, there's a really good chance you're not. So, for me, I'm gonna give this, if I had to give it a rating, I'd give it like a low 5 out of 10. It's almost bordering on a 4, but there's enough good scenes where it did stick me in through the rest of the movie. So I'll give it an average 5 out of 10. This review is only a minute lower than episode 1. Next week, join me as I review Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, and we will conclude the prequel trilogy of Star Wars. Until next time, guys, be well, stay safe, have a good day, and peace.